Hey everyone, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky from the part of the book on the Permanent Revolution. And the section's titled, The Theory of Permanent Revolution Restated. The foregoing exposition of the theory of the permanent revolution was based entirely on Trotsky's writings in the period immediately following 1905, particularly on results and prospects. Since our approach in this study is not strictly chronological, but based on the logic of the subject matter, we may turn to one of Trotsky's much later works by way of concluding the present discussion. In 1928, Karl Radek, until that year one of Trotsky's most loyal supporters within the Soviet Communist Party, read an article attacking the theory of permanent revolution. Footnote: a manuscript copy of this article is in the Trotsky archives. Karl Radek, something in Russian. At the time he wrote this article, Radek was in exile in Siberia as a consequence of Radek's membership in the Joint Opposition and Radek's support of Trotsky against Stalin's policy of, quote, socialism in one country. The article was apparently an attempt to regain the good grace of Stalin. Later in 1929, Radek renounced Trotsky completely and declared his acceptance of Stalin's policies. Radek was rehabilitated and became a leading propagandist for, quote, socialism in one country. In 1936, however, Karl Radek was arrested, tried, and apparently in 1939 executed. See Warren Lerner's Karl Radek, The Last Internationalist, published in 1970. Chapter 8. Chapter 7 of the same book deals with the relation between Trotsky and Radek. I don't really see any description of this book, so I can't find anything for it, sorry. End footnote. By that time, Trotsky's political career was at its end. Trotsky had been banished to Alma-Ata in Central Asia. Trotsky's name had been discredited. Trotsky's views and deeds widely denounced. Attacks on the theory of permanent revolution were now nothing new. They had begun in 1924 and were the ideological basis for the gradual exclusion of Trotsky from all political functions. Footnote: Trotsky's controversy with Stalin over the question of, quote, socialism in one country is discussed in Chapter 9 below. End footnote. Thus, Radek's article merely repeated already well-known accusations of doctrinal heresy. But the fact that it was written by one who in the past had been such an ardent supporter of the theory must have particularly stung Trotsky. In the event, Trotsky composed during 1928 an extended reply to Radek, which became a book under the title of The Permanent Revolution. Footnote: all references are to the first Russian edition published in Berlin in 1930. For the English translation, see Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution and Results and Prospects, published in London, 1962. End footnote. The book Permanent Revolution is primarily a polemic against Radek and, of course, Stalin. The Permanent Revolution is also marred by Trotsky's exaggerated efforts to show how close Trotsky and Lenin had always been theoretically. Footnote: quoting Lenin had by then become standard practice, and the legitimacy of one's views depended on such quotations. In spite of himself and his many apologies in the book, Trotsky, for obvious political reasons, adopted this practice. The result is that he minimizes the difference between himself and Lenin, calling them, quote, tactical, when in fact they were quite substantial. End footnote. But underneath the polemics, there is a restatement, by way of defense, of the theory of the permanent revolution, which aims at clarifying and refining the views first expressed following 1905. For this reason, and despite the fact that the book adds nothing essentially new to those views, is worth summarizing briefly. Footnote: in what follows, all those portions of the book permanent revolution, which relate to the post-1917 period, have been excluded and relegated to later chapters where questions of the concrete application of the theory of permanent revolution are discussed. Here, purely theoretical issues only are raised. End footnote. The permanent revolution concentrates on three main issues: the role of the peasantry in a workers' revolution, the bourgeois features of the revolution, and its transition to a socialist or collectivist phase, and the importance of the world revolution. The first issue is the most extensively discussed, since the main charge against Trotsky had been that Trotsky had not only underestimated but ignored the peasants, that his rejection of Lenin's formula, quote, "the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry," end quote, constituted a gross error which alone discredited the theory of the permanent revolution. Trotsky now admitted the rejection but not the error, and claimed, although in an intentionally restrained, even oblique manner, to have been right against Lenin. Footnote. For obvious tactical reasons, Trotsky avoided throughout the book any outright criticism of Lenin. Thus, Trotsky spoke of the need to see Lenin's views on the issue of the peasants as continuously, quote, developing, as raising tentative possibilities rather than final conclusions, as being rooted in a specific historical context, and so on, whereas in fact Lenin's mind was far more made up than this would imply. End footnote. Far from ignoring the peasants, Trotsky argued, Trotsky had based his whole theory precisely on the fact that their position had become so intolerable as to make them a revolutionary force. A force, moreover, without which a Russian revolution would have been inconceivable. The agrarian problem had become the most severe of Russia's dilemmas, and the agrarian problem could no longer be solved except through an agrarian revolution. But an agrarian revolution was not necessarily a peasant revolution, though it was, of course, impossible without the participation of the peasants. The question which had to be asked in 1905 was whether the peasants themselves were capable of solving their problems, of acting, that is, as an independent political force. And about this there were not two points of view. Bolsheviks as well as Mensheviks agreed that this was out of the question, that without the leadership of either the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, the peasants could not carry out a revolution. The Mensheviks, of course, believed that the bourgeoisie would ultimately make their own revolution, thereby settling the agrarian problem as well. But if the impossibility of a bourgeois revolution was not clear to them, as it should have been, in 1905, it certainly became incontrovertible in the course of time. The issue was therefore the relationship between the peasantry and the proletariat. Neither could act without the other, so much was obvious. But did their necessary alliance imply an equal distribution of power, and therefore of roles? Over this differences of opinion arose. Lenin, correctly perceiving that their joint revolution would be initially an agrarian revolution, assumed as a result that it would take the form of a dictatorship of both classes. As a formal, quote, algebraic proposition, this was unacceptable, but it did not resolve the question of how the fundamental social incompatibility between workers and peasants could be reconciled. The truth of the matter, Trotsky observed, was that no such reconciliation was possible, and the alliance had to be seen as a purely temporary political stratagem. To attribute to it more permanent features would mean undermining the goals which were a part of the workers' program. It would mean arresting the revolution of the revolution's agrarian stage. This was so because while the workers could identify with peasant aspirations, the peasants could not identify with the aspirations of the workers. A reconciliation between the workers and peasants, therefore, implied numerous concessions on the part of the workers and none on the part of the peasants. In that case, however, the proposed dictatorship was an effect of the peasants alone, and the whole revolution stood in danger of collapsing, for there was no guarantee that the peasants could in fact act in this independent capacity. On the contrary, They could act as a revolutionary force only by attaching themselves to, and being dragged along by, another class which, though weaker numerically, was stronger in terms of its political organization and social consciousness. The role of the peasants, therefore, had to be grasped not in the role of the peasants' formal sense. It did not matter what one called the revolutionary dictatorship, but in concrete political terms, the actual distribution of power in a revolutionary regime. The only realistic conclusion was that the dictatorship must be of the proletariat alone. Quote, "Not for nothing did the radical thinkers occasionally refer to the peasant as the Sphinx of Russian history. The question of the nature of the revolutionary dictatorship... is inseparably bound up with the question of the possibility of a revolutionary peasant party hostile to the liberal bourgeoisie and independent of the proletariat. The decisive meaning of the latter question is not hard to grasp. Were the peasantry capable of creating their own independent party in the epoch of the democratic revolution, then the democratic dictatorship could be realized in its truest and most direct sense, and the question of the participation of the proletarian minority in the revolutionary government would have an important, it is true, but subordinate significance. The case is entirely otherwise if we proceed from the fact that the peasantry, because of the peasantry's intermediate position and the heterogeneity of the peasantry's social composition, can have neither an independent policy nor an independent party, but is compelled in the revolutionary epoch to choose between the policy of the bourgeoisie and the policy of the proletariat. Only this evaluation of the political nature of the peasantry opens up the prospect of the dictatorship of the peasantry growing directly out of the democratic revolution. Jesus Christ. Only this evaluation of the political nature of the peasantry opens up the prospect of the dictatorship of the proletariat growing directly out of the democratic revolution. In this, naturally, there lies no, quote, denial, quote, ignoring, or, quote, underestimation of the peasantry. Without the decisive significance of the agrarian question for the life of the whole of society, and without the great depth and gigantic sweep of the peasant revolution, there could not even be any talk of the proletarian dictatorship in Russia. But the fact that the agrarian revolution created the conditions for the dictatorship of the proletariat grew out of the inability of the peasantry to solve the peasantry's own historical problem with the peasantry's own forces and under the peasantry's own leadership. End quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. Footnote. Trotsky dealt with the peasant issue in a somewhat rambling and disjointed fashion, but the most important passages appear on pages 8 to 10, 47, 70 to 84, 104 to 6, and 112 to 18. End footnote. The second issue with which Trotsky dealt in the Permanent Revolution was that of the transition from purely bourgeois objectives to socialist objectives. The opponents of the theory of the Permanent Revolution had accused Trotsky of political adventurism. Trotsky had assumed, they claimed, that the whole historical stages can be, quote, skipped. That whole historical stages can be, quote, skipped or, quote, leapt over. That a backward autocratic society could be immediately transformed into a socialist one. To these charges, Trotsky now answered that they were partly a deliberate misrepresentation of his theory and partly a misunderstanding of his theory. The misrepresentation was contained in the charge that Trotsky chose to neglect the necessarily bourgeois stage, which must precede a socialist revolution. But this was like the charge that he had ignored the peasants. Trotsky observed. In fact, Trotsky had never denied that amongst the tasks of the revolution would be some purely bourgeois democratic ones. Purely bourgeois democratic tasks. After all, this is what the agrarian revolution was all about, and this is what was to be initially involved in the overthrow of the autocracy. To this extent, Trotsky had always agreed with Lenin, that in the absence of an independent bourgeoisie, it was incumbent upon the proletariat to carry out bourgeois reforms, but to designate, consequently, the revolution as bourgeois in character was to speak of its short-term objectives, not its ultimate prospects. Quote, "I never denied," end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, "the bourgeois character of the revolution in the sense of the revolution's immediate historical task, but only in the sense of its driving forces and its perspectives," end quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. A revolution, in other words, had to be defined by the revolution's telos, the revolution's ultimate end, not the revolution's intermediate stages. By having a telos, the revolution was also a, quote, organic whole, and thus the attempt to distinguish between stages as clearly separate and unrelated was, quote, vulgar Marxism, end quote. Social relations develop and evolve, stages grow one into another, and revolution is an ongoing process, not a clearly demarcated timetable. The failure to grasp this dynamic character of social life, particularly in a time of revolution, was the source of the misunderstanding of the concept of a permanent revolution. It led to a, quote, metaphysical posing of the question concerning the, quote, bourgeois or the, quote, socialist character of the revolution, end quote, Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution, which could only end in a schematic, unrealistic view of history. As against this, to grasp the revolution as a process was to grasp the full extent of the revolution's possibilities, to see beyond the present and into the future. The telos of a process was not exhausted by its beginnings, but it could be perceived through them. The peculiar beginnings of the Russian Revolution must therefore determine the Russian Revolution's ultimate character. The, quote, immediate tasks, end quote, of those beginnings were bourgeois, but the instrument for implementing the task contained the seed of their ultimate evolution. Quote, ... the dictatorship of the proletariat does not come after the completion of the democratic revolution. ... No, the dictatorship of the proletariat appeared probable and even inevitable on the basis of the bourgeois revolution, precisely because there was no other power and no other way to solve the tasks of the agrarian revolution. But exactly this opens up the prospect of a democratic revolution growing over into the socialist revolution. End quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. Trotsky emphasized that a revolution was just this process of, quote, growing over, end quote, not a skipping over stages. The notion that socialism could be suddenly and immediately made to flower in the soil of feudal autocracy was, Trotsky agreed, indeed absurd. But it was not a notion, Trotsky said, which emerged in the theory of the permanent revolution. On the contrary, the theory of the permanent revolution excluded it entirely. The theory of the permanent revolution saw the revolution as the means through which society only accelerated or completed the processes of change which are already inherent in society. It was precisely because these processes could not culminate within the old framework that revolution became necessary. The result was not some artificial tampering with history, but its natural evolution. Quote, in Russia, ... history combined the main content of the bourgeois revolution with the first stage of the proletarian revolution, did not mix them up but combined them organically. End quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. There was no, quote, leaping over stages here, no miraculous transformations. There was only the possibility of, quote, telescoping the stages into, quote, embryonic forms, end quote, of shortening the time period of historical changes which would otherwise be the work of centuries. That such an accelerated pace was possible in Russia was to be directly explained by Russian backwardness. Because the tasks of the past, the agrarian revolution, were not carried out in the past by those who should have done so, namely the bourgeoisie, they must now be carried out by others, namely the proletariat. But had there been an agrarian revolution, The Russian proletariat, because of Russia's backwardness, would have been the last in Europe to come to power. As it was, backwardness both prevented an agrarian revolution and propelled the Russian proletariat into power ahead of European workers. Thus the tasks of the past were combined with those of the present, and thus arose the possibility of shortening the gap between them. But this, again, was not an abstract, quote, leap into the future. It was no, quote, isolated leap of the proletariat, end quote. Rather, it was the, quote, reconstruction of the whole nation under the leadership of the proletariat, end quote. The combining of stages made possible a shortcut into the modern world. The delays and omissions of the past were made up for by the possibilities of the present. In a word, this was how a backward country caught up with history. Quote, that is how, end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, from 1905 onwards, I conceived and interpreted the prospects of the permanent revolution, end quote. Trotsky, the permanent revolution. It was the continuous, unbroken evolution of tasks which gave the revolution its, quote, uninterrupted, end quote, character. Footnote. Throughout the book, Trotsky used the term, quote, uninterrupted as interchangeable or synonymous with, quote, permanent. Sometimes Trotsky wrote, quote, permanent, and in brackets added, quote, uninterrupted. End footnote. Rather than stopping at any particular stage, the revolution, quote, grew over, end quote, into more advanced phases. The complete, quote, reconstruction of the nation, end quote, the nation's modernization, was the work of one revolutionary process, telescoped into one historical epoch. However, the actual completion of this task depended also on a more or less simultaneous revolution in Europe. This raised the third and, in a sense, the most important issue which Trotsky had to confront at the time of writing The Permanent Revolution. Trotsky was as convinced 12 years after October 1917 as Trotsky had been some 12 years before, that a workers' revolution confined to the frontiers of Russia stood in danger of collapsing. A backward country may have the first workers' revolution, but it could not arrive at socialism before the advanced countries are outside the context of world history. Trotsky listed this as one of the, quote, basic postulates, end quote, of the theory of the permanent revolution. Footnote. At the end of the permanent revolution, Trotsky appended a list of 14, quote, basic postulates, which Trotsky said constituted the, quote, principal conclusions, end quote, of the theory of the permanent revolution. End footnote. Quote, backward countries may, under certain conditions, arrive at the dictatorship of the proletariat sooner than advanced countries, but they will arrive later than the latter at socialism, ... In a country where the proletariat has power in its hands as the result of the democratic revolution, the subsequent fate of the dictatorship and socialism depends in the last analysis, not only and not so much upon the national productive forces as upon the development of the international socialist revolution. End quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. Similarly, in the introduction to the book, Trotsky stated that whenever the question, quote, do you really believe that Russia is ripe for the socialist revolution, end quote, was asked of Trotsky, he, quote, always answered, quote, always answered, end quote, quote, no, I do not. But world economy as a whole, and the European economy in the first place, is fully ripe for the socialist revolution. Whether the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia leads to socialism or not, and at what tempo and through what stages, will depend upon the fate of European and world capitalism, end quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. By 1929, Trotsky's optimism about a European revolution had become naturally more guarded but far from exhausted. Footnote. His views on revolutionary prospects in Europe are discussed in Chapter 8 and 9 below. End footnote. In any case, Trotsky could see no other way of saving Russia for socialism. Trotsky believed that Russia on her own had by then more or less exhausted all her internal possibilities. The dictatorship of the proletariat, Trotsky thought, had been turned into fact. The foundations for collectivism had been prepared, but further development in this latter direction was no longer feasible. Not only was socialist policy becoming sterile as a result of the limitations imposed upon it by national boundaries, there was the further danger that the economic scarcities of the country would undermine even the rudiments of, quote, national reconstruction, end quote. It was at this point, therefore, that the primitive foundations of the old society might reassert themselves. Backwardness, the source of revolutionary change, might become a fetter upon change itself. A proletarian regime would be hard-pressed to remain in one place, much less advance. Footnote. See Trotsky's introduction written in March 1930 to the German edition of Permanent Revolution. End footnote. Under such conditions, socialism was out of the question, and the future of the socialist revolution was thus more than ever bound up with world history. Quote, the completion of the socialist revolution within national limits is unthinkable. ... The socialist revolution begins on the national arena. The socialist revolution unfolds on the international arena. The socialist revolution begins on the national arena. The socialist revolution unfolds on the international arena and is completed on the world arena. Thus, the socialist revolution becomes a permanent revolution in a newer and broader sense of the word. The socialist revolution attains completion only in the final victory of the new society on our entire planet. End quote. Trotsky, Permanent Revolution. Okay, so that's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening. The next section is titled The Permanent Revolution's Scope and Limits.